In 1999, Ratan Tata walked into a meeting in Detroit. He wasn't there to buy Ford. He was there because he was considering selling part of his own company to them. At the time, Tata Motors was trying to do something that looked almost impossible: build a serious passenger car business in India. Its first major attempt was the Tata Indica. And the Indica had a problem. It wasn't selling well enough. The passenger car division was struggling. So Tata began looking for an exit. And Ford was interested. For Ford, this wasn't a meeting between equals. Ford was one of the biggest names in the American automobile industry. Tata Motors was still trying to prove it belonged in the passenger car business. And that difference in power mattered. Because when two companies sit across a table, the side with more options usually has more power. Ford had plenty of options. Tata had a problem to solve. And according to the version of the story that later became famous, the meeting did not go well. The story says Ford executives questioned why Tata had entered the passenger car business in the first place, and that Ford was effectively offering to rescue Tata from a mistake. But there's a problem with that story. Some of the most dramatic details have since been disputed. So forget the revenge story for a moment, because what happened next is more interesting. Tata didn't sell. He walked away. And instead of abandoning the passenger car business, he kept going. At that moment, almost nobody could have known what that decision would eventually lead to. Because 9 years later, the man who had walked into Detroit looking for a buyer would return to the global automobile industry from a completely different position, not as the seller, as the buyer, and the company on the other side of the table would be Ford. The meeting was over, and Tata had a decision to make. He could walk away from the passenger car business, or he could try to prove that the business could work. He chose the second option. Tata Motors kept investing in the Indica, and that decision mattered, because the Indica wasn't just another new car. It was an attempt to prove that an Indian company could design, engineer, and manufacture a passenger car for the mass market. That was a much bigger challenge than simply building a car. Tata was trying to build credibility, and credibility takes time. The company continued developing its passenger car business. It improved the Indica. It expanded production, and gradually, the car began finding its place on Indian roads. But Tata wasn't interested in stopping there. The company was becoming more ambitious. And the next step wasn't simply to sell more cars in India. It was to become a global automobile company. That meant something had to change. Tata needed technology. It needed engineering capabilities. It needed international distribution. And eventually, it needed something much bigger than the Indica. Because while Tata was trying to build an automobile empire, Ford was building one of its own. And Ford's empire was about to become very expensive. Jaguar, Land Rover, two of the most recognizable names in the luxury automobile world. Ford had spent billions acquiring them. At the time, it looked like a brilliant strategy. But by the middle of the next decade, the strategy was starting to look very different. Because the same company that had once been sitting across the table from Tata was beginning to discover that owning luxury brands was much easier than making money from them. And Ford was about to face a choice: keep them, or find someone else willing to take them. Ford didn't just want to sell more cars. It wanted something much bigger: a global automobile empire. And one of the easiest ways to build that empire wasn't to create every luxury brand from scratch. It was to buy the brands that already had something Ford couldn't manufacture overnight: history, prestige, and recognition. So Ford went shopping. In 1989, it acquired Jaguar. Then, in 2000, it acquired Land Rover from BMW. Suddenly, Ford wasn't just competing in the mass-market automobile business. It controlled two of the most recognizable names in luxury automobiles. Jaguar brought prestige. Land Rover brought off-road capability and a powerful luxury SUV identity. Together, they looked like an extraordinary collection of brands. And on paper, the strategy made sense. Ford had the manufacturing scale, the distribution network, the engineering resources, and now it had luxury brands that could sit at the top of the portfolio. But there was a problem. Buying a famous brand is one thing. Making that brand profitable is another. Jaguar was expensive to operate. Land Rover required enormous investment. And the luxury market was becoming increasingly competitive. Ford kept putting money into the brands. New models, new technology, new marketing, new engineering. The empire kept getting bigger. But bigger doesn't automatically mean better. And eventually, Ford had to confront a question that every empire eventually faces. What if the assets you bought are worth more to someone else than they are to you? Because by the middle of the 2000s, Ford was no longer simply building an empire. It was trying to figure out how to carry it. And then, the world changed. The financial crisis was approaching, and Ford was about to discover just how heavy its luxury empire had become. Ford's luxury strategy looked impressive from the outside, but the numbers were telling a different story. Jaguar was struggling to make consistent profits. Land Rover needed constant investment to keep growing, and Ford was spending heavily on both brands. New models required enormous amounts of money. Engineering costs were rising across the industry. So were development times and marketing expenses. Ford still believed the brands had potential, but potential doesn't pay the bills. The problem was becoming harder to ignore. Ford owned valuable brands with expensive operations, and those operations needed continuous financial support. There was another problem waiting ahead. The American economy was becoming increasingly unstable. By the middle of the decade, warning signs appeared. Housing prices had started falling across America. Credit markets were becoming increasingly fragile, and financial institutions were beginning to panic. At first, the automobile industry kept moving. Consumers were still buying cars, but that confidence wouldn't last forever. Then the financial crisis finally reached Detroit. And suddenly, Ford had bigger problems to solve. The company needed cash more than ever. It needed to protect its core business, and its luxury brands were consuming resources. Jaguar and Land Rover weren't necessarily worthless. They simply didn't fit Ford anymore. The question was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Should Ford keep funding the luxury empire? Or should it finally let those brands go? Ford would soon have to choose, and that decision would change Tata's story forever. By 2008, Ford's situation had changed dramatically. The company was fighting to protect its core business. America's economy was entering a severe crisis, and consumers were pulling back on expensive purchases. Ford needed cash. It needed flexibility. and it needed to simplify the business. That meant looking closely at everything it owned, including Jaguar and Land Rover. These were still valuable brands, but Ford could no longer afford to treat them casually. The luxury empire that once looked strategic was now becoming a financial burden. And then Ford made its decision. It would sell Jaguar and Land Rover. The announcement changed the story completely, because suddenly, Tata wasn't the company trying to prove itself. Ford was the company looking for a buyer, and that buyer was already interested. Ratan Tata had spent years building Tata Motors. He had built the Indica. He had expanded beyond India's borders. And now he had an opportunity, not to buy another ordinary car company, but to acquire two legendary British brands. There was just one problem. Tata had never operated anything like this before. Jaguar was a luxury sports car business. Land Rover was a global premium SUV business. Both needed serious investment. Both faced intense competition. And both came with enormous expectations. Still, Tata was willing to take the risk. In March 2008, the deal was announced. Tata Motors would acquire Jaguar and Land Rover. The price was about $2.3 billion. And the irony was impossible to miss. 9 years earlier, Ford had humiliated Tata. Now Ford was selling its luxury empire to the very man it had once dismissed. The balance of power had completely reversed. And this time, Tata was sitting on the other side of the table. Tata had just spent $2.3 billion. But what exactly had it bought? It wasn't simply two famous car brands. Tata was taking control of something much larger. Thousands of employees, factories across Britain, engineering teams with decades of experience, design studios, technology, intellectual property, and a global network built around Jaguar and Land Rover. On paper, it looked like an enormous collection of assets. But there was a problem. Most of those assets were expensive to keep alive. And the world was entering one of the worst financial crises in decades. Luxury cars were becoming harder to sell. Consumers were pulling back. Credit was tightening. And businesses everywhere were protecting cash, which meant Tata had inherited two prestigious brands. At exactly the wrong moment. Jaguar had the heritage. Land Rover had the reputation. But heritage doesn't pay the bills. And reputation doesn't guarantee sales. Tata now had to do something Ford had struggled to do. Turn those brands into businesses that could survive. That meant making difficult decisions. Where should the money go? Which models deserved investment? Which technologies could be shared? And how could Tata protect what made Jaguar and Land Rover different from everyone else? The easiest answer would have been to cut costs, close things down, reduce investment, and wait for the crisis to pass. But Tata chose a different path. He had not bought JLR simply to own it. He had bought it because he believed it could become something much bigger. And that belief was about to be tested. Because within months of the acquisition, the global economy was collapsing around them. The $2.3 billion purchase was already history. Now came the expensive part, keeping the dream alive. Most companies would have reacted to the crisis by cutting back. Tata had another idea. Instead of asking how much could be saved, he had to ask what was worth protecting. Because Jaguar and Land Rover were not ordinary car companies. Their value came from something difficult to measure: identity. Jaguar had spent decades building an image around elegance and performance. Land Rover had built its reputation around capability and adventure. Those identities were expensive to create and almost impossible to rebuild once lost. So Tata's challenge wasn't simply to reduce costs. It was to protect what made these brands valuable, while changing the business underneath them. And that meant investment, new products, new technology, better engineering, and eventually more efficient engines and platforms. The strategy was surprisingly simple. Don't destroy the brands to survive the crisis. Make the brand strong enough to survive it. But there was one enormous problem. Tata was making this bet while the global economy was still falling apart. Every new investment required cash. Every new model required years of development. And there was no guarantee customers would return. This is where the acquisition became more than a trophy purchase. It became a test of patience. Because Tata wasn't buying a quick turnaround. He was buying time. Time for Jaguar to find its identity again. Time for Land Rover to expand beyond its traditional market. And time for the company to build products people actually wanted. The first results wouldn't come immediately. There would be losses. There would be pressure. And there would be moments when the entire decision could have looked like a mistake. But then something began to change. The products started changing. The brand started changing. And slowly, the market started paying attention. Because Tata had made a bet most companies were afraid to make. He had bought a struggling luxury business and decided to invest in its future. Now the question was no longer, why did Tata buy Jaguar Land Rover? The more interesting question was, could he actually make it work? The bet was expensive, but slowly, something started to change. Jaguar and Land Rover were no longer being treated as brands Ford simply needed to manage. Under Tata, they were becoming businesses that needed to grow. And that meant investing in the products. The strategy wasn't to erase what made these brands special. It was to build on it. Jaguar needed cars that could compete in a changing luxury market. Land Rover needed to become more than a specialist off-road brand. And both needed technology that could make their vehicles more efficient. That required money. A lot of it. New models had to be developed. Engines had to improve. Designs had to evolve. And the company needed to compete with some of the world's strongest luxury manufacturers. But there was a crucial difference now. The investment wasn't being made to protect Ford's portfolio. It was being made with a long-term view. Tata was willing to give the brands time. And that patience began producing results. New Jaguar models started attracting attention. Land Rover expanded its range. The products became more modern. And the brands began reaching customers far beyond their traditional markets. The transformation wasn't instant. There were still losses. There were still difficult years. But the direction had changed. JLR was no longer simply trying to survive. It was starting to build a future. And that future depended on something Tata had understood from the beginning. Sometimes the value of a struggling business isn't what it is today. It's what it could become, if someone is willing to invest long enough to find out. For a while, the bet still looked dangerous. The financial crisis had not disappeared, and JLR still had plenty to prove. But the business was beginning to find its footing. The products were getting stronger. The brands were becoming more relevant. And customers were responding. Land Rover, in particular, found a powerful opportunity. The world was changing. Luxury customers didn't just want traditional prestige anymore. They wanted technology, comfort, design, and the ability to use a luxury vehicle almost anywhere. Land Rover was perfectly positioned for that shift. Jaguar was taking a different path. It was becoming more modern, more focused, and increasingly willing to challenge the established luxury players. The important thing was that Tata hadn't tried to turn Jaguar into another BMW or Land Rover into another Mercedes. It allowed each brand to keep its own identity, and that mattered, because the value of these companies had never been just their factories. It was the brands themselves, the design language, the engineering expertise, the emotional connection with customers. And now, those things were being backed by fresh investment. The results eventually became impossible to ignore. JLR was no longer simply the troubled collection of brands Ford had once struggled to manage. It had become a growing luxury automotive business. And suddenly, the $2.3 billion price tag looked very different. What had seemed like an enormous gamble was beginning to look like one of Tata's smartest acquisitions. But there was an even bigger irony. Ford had once decided that Jaguar and Land Rover were too difficult to carry. Tata had looked at exactly the same problem and seen an opportunity. And that difference in perspective is where the real story begins. And this brings us back to the beginning. In 2008, Ford wanted out. Jaguar and Land Rover had become difficult businesses to carry. The financial crisis made that problem even harder. So Ford sold them. Tata bought them. And at the time, plenty of people could have looked at that deal and wondered what Tata was thinking. But the most interesting part of this story isn't that Tata bought two famous brands. It's what he saw that Ford didn't. Ford saw businesses that needed money. Tata saw brands that could still create value. Ford was trying to simplify. Tata was willing to invest. And that difference mattered. Because businesses aren't always worth what their current numbers suggest. Sometimes the real value is hidden inside the things those numbers don't capture. A loyal customer, a powerful brand, a talented engineering team, a product people still care about, and a management team willing to think beyond the next quarter. Tata didn't get a guaranteed success story. He bought a problem. Then he gave that problem time, capital, and patience. And eventually, the problem became an opportunity. That is the irony of the Ford-Tata story. The same assets one company wanted to escape became some of the most important brands in another company's portfolio. So perhaps the biggest lesson isn't about Jaguar, or Land Rover, or even Ford. It's about perspective. Because sometimes, the difference between a bad asset and a great investment is simply knowing what you are looking at.